So from those 3 detailed examples, I wanted to share those with you again, just to share some of that stuff from my perspective and working from an Indigenous organization on what that might look like. So what I do want to share here too next are some of the failures. Okay? So I've shared with you some details. Hopefully you can see that from someone else's shoes. Some of the failures, and as I've said, people are complex. We're humans, we work with humans, we know this in HR. People are always doing things that we don't expect them to do, and that is our lives, and that's how, that's what we sign up for when we get into HR. And so with that comes the fact that you have to be able to admit that you have done things wrong and that you've made mistakes. The good thing about that is being able to learn from them. And so what I want to share these with you so that you can reflect on that and hopefully learn and maybe not make some of the same mistakes that I've made in the past. Okay. So my first example here of a failure is using the word stakeholder. We use this in business all the time, the word stakeholder. That is, in my experience when I was there, I was told that that was actually quite offensive to a First Nation. And that goes back to the fact that they're sovereign bodies working nation to nation. They're not stakeholders, they're rights holders. So a handy book, if we go back to Bob Joseph and his 23, it's a free download. That you can actually download this short ebook, but 23 things to not say or do about working effectively with Indigenous peoples, and this is the first one. Don't use the word stakeholder. And I did learn that the hard way, although that did lead me to find his book. So really that worked out well. Another example is kind of forcing a process versus building a relationship. And in Indigenous cultures, building that relationship is much more important than getting the job done. And there was a scenario where I was working with a community and the chief wanted to meet me in person before we could actually get ahead and start working on this work, even though all of the work I was doing was virtual. And so to me, I thought, okay, let's just have a Zoom call, we'll talk about it, we'll meet, we can see each other. And that was not an acceptable way to do that for him. So he actually ended up holding back some of the work we were doing until I was able to come up and to meet him. And I've learned a lot from that. And so important thing about asking about that kind of thing up front. Another example here that I have is in a day-long session with an Indigenous organization. It is so important to have lunch with that group. So food is family and food are 2 of the main important things in Indigenous culture, and lunch is almost always catered, and often it's a local person who's actually just made it and brought it in. And that is just so important to spend that hour with the group, regardless of what you're talking about. You might be having a very complex, stressed, sensitive discussion before and after, but when it's lunch, it's lunch. And that's where people get to talk about things. And I think this is part of working in a culture where people are family, right? They are very close with each other outside of work, and they can oftentimes compartmentalize that and be like, okay, that was work, now it's lunch. And so spending that time not booking another meeting or a phone call in between on your lunch break and actually spending time with the group is a really important thing to do. Credentials. This ties back to my first example about kind of that formal education. It's been recommended to me to leave my credentials off my name tag when I go and talk to people in an Indigenous organization. And it's much more respectful to ask people about their experience than about where they went to school. Okay? Again, these are some of the things that I learned the hard way. Another thing as well, if you're working with organizations, and I've experienced this myself, and I've really tried to think about how I do it, but in my organization I worked with, where we actually only had 1% Aboriginal population out of 400. It was myself and another guy who self-identified. He had concerns about becoming kind of the token native at events. He was asked to go to every career fair, to every external event. He was asked to hang out with the GM, and that there's kind of this line, and I don't have an answer for you on where that is, but being aware that that's not necessarily a good thing for that person. And so how do you have that discussion? And to be honest, he and I had that discussion to say, are you okay with this? Because if you're not, we can push back. And so I think as HR, it's important that we recognize that and we do have that open conversation to try to understand how that person feels about being treated as, and the intents are positive. The organization was treating this positively, but it may not come across that way to that person necessarily. And I think a final example I'll leave you with here of one of my failures is I was in an organization, I was in a community in the north, and the receptionist asked me where I was from, and I told her what I told you earlier, and she spoke to me in her language and then refused to speak to me in English at all. And I don't know her language, I don't know my own language. And so to me, at first I was kind of offended and a little upset about that, but it really occurred to me afterwards that that was kind of her way of saying that I didn't have any authority over her on her territory and her community. And I thought about that afterwards, and I reflect on that now to think, well, how was my behavior when I talked to her? Was I being respectful? She was an elder as well, so, and I think back on that, and I'm not exactly sure what the answer is, but I would definitely approach that differently next time. I do want to share 2 successes. It's not all bad. 2 things that have gone really well from an Indigenous HR perspective is when I'm doing workplace investigations is the ability to learn, to listen. And that's a really important thing in Indigenous culture, especially with elders, is to listen and let them talk. Even if there's a pause, just listening. And that goes a really long way when doing workplace investigations. And finally, I was really lucky enough to take part in a blanket exercise. If you haven't had the opportunity to do one, and you do get invited, I really recommend you go into it with kind of an open mind. But I was invited along with some community members and some senior leaders in the industry and in my organization, non-Indigenous, and the community was Indigenous, and they hosted this blanket exercise, which is really about kind of walking through that 500-year history in 45 minutes. And it is so impactful, and it really puts the person in somebody else's shoes. And just the sharing that people had afterwards about how that made them feel and the impact on them. And these are people I'd worked with for years who were sharing these things that they thought they knew what it was like, and they had no idea until that day. So I do really highly recommend that you do that, and I think that has made, even for myself personally, had a huge impact. So those are some of the successes. So in summary, what I'm sharing these with you for is, as I said, for you to see HR, to see diversity and inclusion from a different perspective. And I've shared my perspective. I want to reiterate, this is my own. I am one person. This is not universal truths, and I really do want you to reflect on your own perspective, your own identity, how you got there, how that's perceived professionally, personally. And I do want you to reach out to your network. I want you to think about who do you know that has stories that they can share that maybe you have never asked before. So your professional network, your family, your friends, and try to really understand how that can impact you and what you can learn from that and take it back to your organizations.